Hello, you are listening to the COVID Inquiry podcast by PA Duffy & Co Solicitors, supported by Broudie Jackson Canter Solicitors. Hosted by Enda McGarrity from PA Duffy & Co Solicitors and Claire McNeilly, Senior Associate from Lanyon Group. The COVID Inquiry podcast will provide commentary, expert insight and opinion on the Module 2C public hearings, which are investigating core decision-making and political governance in Northern Ireland during the pandemic. Each week, Enda and Claire will be joined by guests to discuss evidence from the inquiry. Their interviews will bring listeners up to date with the implications from the Module 2C evidential hearings in a comprehensive and, most importantly, accessible manner. This week, Enda and Claire are joined by Lauren Mallon, Group Member of Northern Ireland COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, Gabriel Scally, Irish Public Health Physician and former Regional Director of Public Health for the South West of England, and journalist Johnny McCambridge. Together, our guests will reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the recommendations coming from the Module 2C investigation. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the PA Duffy COVID-19 Inquiry podcast with me, journalist Claire McNeilly, and my co-host Enda McGarrity, one of the lead solicitors representing the Northern Ireland Bereaved Families for Justice. Today, we'll examine evidence given by key witnesses during the third and final week of Module 2C sitting in Belfast. We heard from some big names, including Health Minister Robin Swann and Northern Ireland's First Minister Michelle O'Neill, who was Deputy First Minister during the pandemic. On Wednesday, Baroness Arlene Foster, former First Minister, gave evidence, as did former Assistant Chief Constable Alan Todd from the Police Service of Northern Ireland. And earlier today, before the closing statements, we heard from Sue Gray, former Permanent Secretary from the Department of Finance. We'll also discuss evidence given by Professor Sir Michael McBride, Northern Ireland's Chief Medical Officer, who hadn't appeared before the inquiry when we recorded last week's podcast. So, Enda, it was a very big week. Before we start, could you please give us your analysis of the revelations, insights, and sometimes tetchy exchanges from the witness box?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So a really significant week and the end to 3 weeks of hearings. So at the time of recording here, we are Thursday afternoon. We finished hearing evidence this morning. So we're just decompressing and taking it all in at this point. But obviously it was the business end of the inquiry as such, where we had the First Minister and former First Minister give evidence. Obviously, at the head of government, they were always going to face a tough round of questioning. I don't think anyone anticipated just how difficult of a grilling they would have received. We also had Robin Swann on Monday, pretty significant witness as well, given that he was head of the Department for Health at the time, responsible for a number of matters, including hospitals and care homes. So we faced some difficult questions on that. On Friday past then, we had Professor Sir Michael McBride, who became very familiar to everyone as the Chief Medical Officer during the pandemic. Very central figure. He faced difficult questions as well about the Department for Health's role generally, but actually his role within that. He was an independent advisor to the department, but also held a managerial role within that. So they went into detail on that in the evidence, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. So we rounded off today then with closing submissions, and closing submissions are really an opportunity for the bereaved families and other core participants to summarise their case and really the evidence that they've heard over the last 3 weeks. Brenda Campbell, KC, spoke on behalf of the bereaved families and gave a really powerful account which summarised the plethora of failures as we see them. And really the overall gist of it was that we need change to be effected through this inquiry. And the bereaved families echoed that outside court afterwards. So a really significant week with some really significant evidence, which we'll begin to unpack in this podcast.
So joining us today is Lauren Mallon, a member of the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice campaign group, who lost her uncle Raymond McNeilly to COVID. We're also pleased to welcome public health expert Dr. Gabriel Scally and Johnny McCambridge, a journalist from PA Ireland who's been covering the inquiry in Belfast. If I could start with you, Lauren, can you tell us a bit about becoming involved with the inquiry and, of course, tell us about Raymond?
Yeah, so I lost my uncle Raymond McNeilly in September of 2021. He was 52 years old and he had Down syndrome. He was a resident in a residential unit in Antrim. And the first time that we were made aware that COVID was in his home was on Monday, the 20th of September, when staff phoned to say that family visiting was cancelled because some clients were showing signs of COVID. Then the following day, the staff phoned back to say that actually they were sending my uncle to hospital as a precaution because he was showing signs of COVID. He was brought to Antrim Area Hospital, and whilst in A&E, my mum received a phone call from staff to say that my uncle was walking around the department. Him being Down syndrome, he couldn't really communicate verbally. A lot of his communication was through Makaton, and which is sort of a sign language, and through us as his family because we knew him. So the nurses were kind of struggling to cope with him and communicate with him as to why he had to stay in one place. So Mum went down to sit with him in A&E. It was in A&E that they did a lateral flow test on him, which was positive at the time, which gave a pretty good indication that he had COVID. But Mum was able to sit with him without being provided with proper PPE, but at least able to sit with him and get him to calm down and just stay where he was, obviously for infection control. The following day then, the hospital rang to say that my uncle had actually tested positive for COVID on a PCR test. He was still in A&E at this point. He hadn't been moved onto a ward. And again, he was wandering around, chatting to everybody, trying to get everybody's attention. He was a very friendly person, so he would have chatted to anybody. So he was a massive risk then for infection. So Mum sat with him anyway that day as well to try and get him to calm down and sort of stay in the one place. He had definitely improved from the previous day. So the previous day she had noticed that he definitely wasn't very well. He had a temperature and his lips were very dry, so they were worried that he was dehydrated. But the following day then he was in good form and good spirits, and he was able to FaceTime some of us at home. The following day then, which was a Thursday, he was moved into a side ward at the hospital. So Mum was able to go and see him in more of a private setting, which meant it was safer for him and for other patients and staff. And this day he was in great form. He was, sitting up, chatting away as much as he could. And his stats weren't great, but at that point, the nurses said, look, if his oxygen levels can stay pretty consistent, then we can think about moving him back to his residential unit because they had oxygen provision there. So his levels were sort of steady at 92, but every time he would stand up, they would drop again. So they were monitoring him, but otherwise he was okay. Mum spent several hours there that night with him, just sitting with him and making sure he was all right. Then if we sort of skip towards Friday, that was really the first day that they said that he was really, really good and he was very stable. And so Mum decided not to visit that day, but said that she would go the following day and bring some supplies for him and things. On the Saturday then, which would have been the 25th of September, Mum received a phone call from the hospital to say that he'd had a good night and that he had breakfast. They told her to bring some clothes for him, some toiletries, things like that. And so she said she would be up around lunchtime. Around 2 o'clock, a doctor phoned my mum asking if she knew what was wrong with him. And she said, well, yes, he has COVID. He's tested positive for COVID. And the doctor, this particular doctor, had a very thick accent, so Mum kind of struggled to communicate with him properly and understand what he was trying to say. Mum then explained that my uncle had type 2 diabetes, and he had an underactive thyroid and a few other kind of minor things like psoriasis, but otherwise he was in fairly good health. But this doctor then said, no, he's very, very sick. And Mum said yes with COVID, but he said no, he's very, very ill. Mum said that she was on her way down to see him, and on arrival at the hospital, the doctors and the nurses wouldn't let her onto the ward at that point. They said that she couldn't enter because he was now in a red zone. Another doctor heard and came over to ask Mum if she was all right. And she said yes, but my brother's in there. And the doctor said yes. This happened to be the same doctor that had been on the phone call with her. And he said yes, Ruben's very sick. And Mum said yes with COVID, and he said no, very, very sick. And at this point, Mum sort of panicked, and she asked him, like, do you mean he's dying? Like, is he that ill? And the doctor just said yes. This was the first mention that he was actually very gravely ill. At this point, we were under the understanding that he was actually okay and that he probably would be all right in the end. The doctor then, our Mum asked if it came to it, would they put him on a ventilator? And the doctor said no, too many issues. Mum then had said, but he's only 52. I mean, he's still young, he's not gravely ill. He has issues, but otherwise he's fairly healthy. And the doctor just said, no, we will not resuscitate if his heart fails. Mum then asked, why not? And the doctor just replied, too many issues. Mum then had to leave the hospital because she wasn't allowed to go in and visit him. And she actually left with all of the supplies that she had brought for him. Around 5:30 that evening, the hospital rang to tell my mum that my uncle was dying. The doctor said that we could go in and see him, even though he was in the red ward, the red zone, sorry, but we had to stay outside of the doors and just look in to see him. They said that if his stats were able to stay stable, that they could then consider moving him into a side ward. But that was on the provision that they were able to stay stable. And at this point, he was trying to get out of bed. He didn't want to stay in bed. He was sitting in a chair. It was a bit chaotic, I think, for everybody involved, because he couldn't understand what was happening to him, and they couldn't communicate to him why they needed to treat him and offer him different interventions. So, for example, they were trying to put an oxygen mask on his face to try and help his stats, but he kept pulling it off because he was terrified. And even though we tried to explain to him why he had to wear this mask, he was there was no way that he was ever going to be able to fully understand what was happening to him. My mum, my grandfather, and then my two sisters were able to go down to the hospital several hours later and view him through a window. Whilst it was welcomed, it was deeply traumatic because you could see him, but you couldn't actually help. And he could see us, but he couldn't understand why we weren't in the room with him. So that was particularly difficult. But the good thing was that eventually his stats were able to be stabilised, and they moved him then out of the red zone into a side ward. And at that point, my two sisters were able to go and sit with him more or less through the night. At this point, they were fully donned up in PPE, and they were able to sit with him and try and calm him down and just be there for him. They left around 3:30 in the morning, and at that point he was very heavily sedated to try and keep him in the bed and to stop him from getting up, because every time he got up his stats would drop again. So the sedation helped to really calm everything down. The Sunday morning then, at 6 a.m, a nurse had phoned my mum to say that my uncle had had a very good night, and and that he was overall okay, and that he had got up at 5 a.m. and he was colouring in. And so the nurse said to my mum, look, just take your time. You don't need to rush down here. He's all right. Within 5 minutes then, the same nurse rang back to say that my uncle was actively dying and that my mum had to get to the hospital ASAP. We live about 20 minutes away from Antrim area. So mum pretty much left immediately. And she arrived at the hospital at 6:31 a.m. But my uncle had died at 6:29. So she just missed him by 2 minutes. What we do know is, though, that he did die with a nurse holding his hand. And that particular nurse happened to have the same name as one of my sisters. So it was quite comforting to know that at least someone with some sort of familiarity would have been there for him. Later that morning then, we were all able to go down and see him and spend a bit of time in the room with him. But again, we were fully donned up in PPE, gloves, masks, everything. And one of the things that I remember is that this sideboard was just outside the red zone, so you could see the doors that had like red sort of stickers and things on them to say don't enter. But in some of the other sideboard rooms, you could see these people, and they were lying in beds, but they were young people. They weren't, they weren't elderly like we were all told during the pandemic. They were sort of middle-aged, I would say. And all I can remember is just the tubes coming out of them everywhere. And I mean, all of this happened when I was 21. So this was a massive traumatic thing to happen to an entire family. But we were very grateful that we were able to have a fairly normal death experience in terms of we were able to visit him and spend a bit of time with him, and we were able to have some sort of a funeral, which a lot of the other families didn't have. So in many respects, I think that we were quite lucky in the end, but we still have a lot of questions around his rights as a disabled person and whether or not he was discriminated against in terms of not being allowed the treatment that an ordinary 52-year-old man would have. And kind of the handling around that in terms of communication with us, it was quite poor. And all of that compounded the trauma and the grief then, because it was such a sharp decline, from being admitted to hospital on a Tuesday to then passing away on the Sunday. It was like sleepwalking through the whole week because it was so quick. It doesn't really allow a lot of time for processing.
And of course, just the way that it all happened. 1 minute you were preparing for him to come home, and then the next minute your mum was told to come to the hospital immediately. And the ultimate cruelty, she didn't get to say goodbye. I mean, I don't think anybody can imagine what that feels like unless they've been in that situation. And I know, Lauren, you had said it was very important for you to go to the inquiry because you wanted to give a voice to Raymond and you wanted to get some answers. And we'll talk a wee bit more about the evidence later, but broadly speaking, at this stage, do you feel you got any answers?
I think it's a difficult question. I think we've definitely learned a lot more than I knew beforehand in terms of kind of the lack of preparedness, and sort of the revelations in terms of the lack of legislation and protection for people with disabilities, and how they were completely not planned into any pandemic response at all. So I think in that way we've had a lot of kind of, I suppose not answers, but I suppose it's more confirmation of things I already knew, in terms of, in a lot of ways people with disabilities didn't stand a chance during the pandemic. There was absolutely no safeguarding, no protections in place. And really, they were just left to die. So I don't know if I'll get proper answers, but I think at least now I feel vindicated in that it's out in the public and we can have this conversation, and hopefully it'll stir some change to happen so that in the future, when another pandemic, which is inevitable, when another pandemic comes at our door, that disabled people are not forgotten about, and that if anything, they're protected more than the average person because they are considerably more susceptible to ill health.
Well, I suppose COVID took everybody by surprise. And some countries dealt with it better than others. I think we've been shocked by some of the things we've learned about Northern Ireland this week. But if I go to you, Gabriel, as a public health expert, you're extremely familiar with all things COVID. So we would like to hear your thoughts on an all-island approach and also your role on Independent Sedge during the pandemic.
Certainly. And I think two very interesting questions. Pretty much every public health person would say that you have to deal with whatever the outbreak is, whatever the infectious disease is. You've got to deal with the population in which it's spreading, not the population that you're responsible for or the population within a particular boundary or border, but the population within which whatever the agent is spreading. And that in Ireland, when I've looked back at it, seemed to be pretty much well embedded across the whole island of Ireland, that there would be a common approach to infectious diseases in animals. And a lot of preparation has taken place and a lot of working up of scenarios and what would happen. And of course, it has been well exercised with things like foot and mouth and so on. But there was a general acceptance that animal health required that all-island approach. And it's worked very well across the whole island. And I was absolutely amazed then in the early days of the pandemic that Northern Ireland continued to think only of itself as part of a political entity, not part of one island, one of two large islands, actually. And what we've learned from across the world is that islands had a big advantage when it came to COVID, and many islands have done extraordinarily well. Really, really highly densely populated and well-connected islands like Taiwan, less connected places like Iceland, and plenty of islands have made use of the ability of being an island to do things better. And one would have logically thought that Britain, the island of Britain and the island of Ireland would take the same approach, and they didn't really. And I think that's come out more than I expected as a potential issue. I was very disappointed in some of the nonsense that went on about different actually, one of the key ones was that there are different lists of symptoms for COVID, north and south. You were told if you have one of these symptoms, go and be tested. Well, in the Republic, they included cough and respiratory difficulties, which is perfectly logical, actually, because it's a respiratory disease. But that wasn't one of the symptoms in Northern Ireland, and that's really weird. And similarly, the Lifford-Strabane difference would be also not just with the number of symptoms that would suggest you had COVID, but if you had COVID, how long you'd be isolated for, and you'd radically different isolation periods being recommended depending on what side of the river you lived. Absolutely crazy stuff. And despite an agreement achieved during COVID between the North and the South, a memorandum of understanding, and a pledge about harmonisation, there was precious little exchange of information. In fact, there were some well-rehearsed rows about the lack of information flow and so on. So I think there was something really big missed there. But to come back to the inquiry stuff and what happened around what's come out in the inquiry, I think one of the things that's come out in the inquiry is how disorganised Northern Ireland really, really was. It's really quite remarkable. We've heard people saying, but we'd had a very hard time with cuts over the last 10 years or whatever, and things weren't, and that's why there was no emergency planning done. That's why there weren't people trained up and ready. That's why the number of public health people had disappeared, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think the inquiry needs to look at those issues in rather more depth. They're sort of concentrating on what happened very much during the COVID outbreak, but some of those things do stretch back and had their results. For example, in the north of Ireland was the only part of these islands, Britain or Ireland, that didn't have local directors of public health in place who could work with communities and could work with councils at a local level and put action in place to try and prevent COVID. So I've been fascinated by the inquiry and some of the testimony, and really this key question of who was in charge at any point in time. It's really almost impossible to work it out. And I thought listening to Robin Swan's testimony, which was he's a very difficult man to follow. Maybe that's just my feeling, but I find his approach to answering questions, and I think very difficult to follow. And I think the excellent barrister for the COVID inquiry, Claire Dobbin, I thought did a very good job, and she's got the patience of a saint. Because she asked the same question again and again and again and wasn't getting any more sensible answers, I thought. But I thought she did a very good job. But the key thing that came over to me was that the Department of Health was only interested in the Department of Health, really. It was only interested in doing what they wanted to do, what they thought they should do, what their chief medical officer told them to do. And seemed to be doing very little as well. They kind of followed blandly and blithely the wisdom from Westminster, which was do nothing. If you remember the Boris Johnson about taking it on the chin and all the stuff about going ahead with assemblies, big gatherings, stopping testing in the community, and all of that stuff. And I haven't seen an iota of independent thinking, really. And I think that's really, really disappointing.
What about independent SEDG then? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, around the end of March, I had got very frustrated about it all, and I was very active on Twitter, and I was fed up shouting at the television at the briefings that were going on, talking nonsense about how masks weren't any good and all the other nonsense they were talking about that time. And I got a call from David King, who was the former government chief scientific officer, and to the UK government, and so David asked some of us to come together as a group and provide scientific advice, but provide it openly, because at that time we weren't allowed to know who the scientific advisors were on SAGE. We weren't allowed to know what their advice was, which was just crazy. Like as if the virus would find out, and you were giving away secrets to the virus or something, that we should know who was on the scientific advisory committee. So we became very, very active and were driving a lot of debate about whether the things were right or wrong at any particular point in time and what the science was really telling us. And I learned a fantastic amount, and I think we were able, judging by the huge following we had we did a weekly briefing at the time that, in fact, the government wasn't doing briefings. And we decided, well, there needs to be public briefings. So we started one on YouTube every Friday, and it had a huge audience of people wanting, and we invited in people who had suffered from COVID and relatives and other experts to talk with us in public. And we did our best to try and produce an informed discussion and more knowledge, because infectious diseases and COVID must have been incredibly scary for so many people. And what you need is to hear from people who care and have the knowledge to help yourself, but help society reduce the impact. And we just weren't hearing that. So Independent SAGE, and it continues to this day to be providing advice when asked.
And of course, you had many journalists phoning you to find out what was going on. I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to speak to Johnny McCambridge or not during that time. But Johnny, you're a very experienced hack. You've seen it all before. What did you make of this week's evidence? Was there anything that surprised you? Just broadly, we'll talk about the individual witnesses as we go on.
Yeah, I think one of the key phrases, Claire, and like yourself, we have seen it all before, and that was one of the, I suppose, the really disappointing things. One of the things I kept coming back to whenever you were hearing about all this, you try and be fair, but you can only call it dysfunctionality. Was the victims, because obviously when you're working as a journalist and you're processing information and you're dealing with it in a sense mechanically. I kept having to remind myself that there were victims there and what it all meant and what it was all about. And what I found myself thinking about quite a few times, broadening this out, was having sat through RHI inquiry years ago, which is a totally different subject, to do with environmental initiative and wasting of public money, but how some of the themes of that we're coming back again. By that I mean the working in silos, departments looking after their own business, not cooperating, the lack of political leadership, the obvious tensions between ministers, the communication happening in WhatsApp groups rather than more official ways. The sort of level of dysfunction, I suppose, between the politicians and the civil service, and how, having been through all that years ago, and now sitting here years later, where for an inquiry for something which was so much more serious, because every decision that was made or wasn't made, or every delay had an impact, obviously, on the infection rate and ultimately on the number of people who died. And having that feeling that almost in a depressing way that we haven't learned anything from all of the recommendations that were made years ago. Now, obviously, you put it into its context. I mean, Stormont was just coming back after a 3-year break. There were new ministers in there, but I suppose the broad themes were that lack of anyone leading the thing through those first months. The fact that the Department of Health were in charge, the Executive Office were so slow to get involved, and then later, whenever they did get involved, we went into, I'm sure we'll talk about the Bobby Story funeral and the cross-community vote. But I just kept coming back again, and then hearing the summing up today, thinking of the, how terrible it must be for a bereaved family to go through that, and then to have to sit and listen to this level of dysfunction, and seeing some of the evidence and the document dump, the tension between the ministers, the snarly comments in the WhatsApp group, just so many times it struck the wrong tone for me, and you come to the end of it, Claire, and you really do think nothing has been obviously learned from mistakes which have been shown before about the lack of political dysfunction. And we do have a very individualist political system in Northern Ireland, and you did have them coming back again and again to saying this is how things are done in Northern Ireland. But the need for political leadership to break out of that, and particularly in the time of a public health emergency, for someone to put their hands up and say, I'm in charge and we're going to take charge of this and we're going to act in the right way.
Yeah, I just think the themes, RHI and this, it's just the overarching lack of accountability in Northern Ireland for anything.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a good time to have a look at the witnesses. We'll start with Professor Sir Michael McBride. He, of course, as the Chief Medical Officer, he played a key role during the pandemic. On the one hand, he had a managerial role in the Department of Health, and on the other, he was an independent medical advisor to the government. His evidence also revealed, as you said, Johnny, the department's silo mentality and the failure to raise the alarm for a cross-governmental response. So, Gabriel, maybe I'll ask you for your take on that, and maybe how important is it for the government to have independent advice?
Well, it's extremely important that the government does have a good source of expert advice on the health of the population. And that's really where the posts of Chief Medical Officer came from. And there's one in the 4 parts of the UK, and there's one in the Republic of Ireland as well. And they go back to the middle of the 19th century, some of those posts. And the job always was to speak out on behalf of the health of the population and to speak truth to power and openly do so. I think two points to make about the Northern Ireland situation. Firstly, having worked both in public health, both in Northern Ireland and in England, and as a senior civil servant in the Department of Health for a fair bit of the time as well, the Chief Medical Officer post in England is of a different style, different positioning within government, in in that it is the government's chief medical officer. And it's quite common for CMOs to be advising the Prime Minister directly. Now, what came up a couple of times was that the CMO post in Northern Ireland does not have that level of seniority. It is a post within and part of the Department of Health. And alongside that, I think we have heard along the way some statements about the poor staffing of the Public Health Agency, the decline in the number of public health doctors, which really were very, very serious. But one of the, and in fact, but for me, the major difference is that in recent years, there's been a tendency in the 4 countries, Wales hasn't gone down this route yet, but the other countries have, to appoint non-public health trained doctors to the chief medical officer post. Now, that's partly because the healthcare issues and NHS issues are really important. But what it misses out and has missed out, and I think tragically so, as exposed by COVID, is the health of the population. And this recognition right across the UK that there is a huge public health crisis with life expectancy actually falling across most of the UK, really unusual. And I grew up in Northern Ireland where the life expectancy was 2 or 3 years better than the Republic. And now it's absolutely the other way around and going in the wrong direction. And that hasn't really emerged, that whole destruction of the public health system. And you can't, it's not reasonable to expect chief medical officers who are not public health doctors to be taking the lead, I think, on what is clearly a public health emergency.
Well, I liked what you said about speaking truth to power. And Enda, I wonder, would your clients characterise the chief medical officer as having done that during the pandemic?
I don't believe so, Claire. One of the big difficulties with the chief medical officer, and it came out quite a bit in the evidence, was the fact that he was wearing too many hats. Brenda Campbell explained in the closing submissions today that he had boundless power, which I don't think is an exaggeration when you have a look at the chronology in the early days of the pandemic. He was obviously the first person to be notified and have a knowledge of the severity of the risk. That came about from an email from Mark Woolhouse, who's the Scottish CMO, I believe, on the 25th of January 2020. And it was clear from that email that the statistics were pretty grave, and they were particularly so for vulnerable people. So even at that point, even if there was a lack of planning, the alarm had been sounded. There could have been a whole government response much, much earlier than what there was. So I guess to the point of the difficulties with the CMO wearing too many hats, there needs to be a clear divide, I think, between independent advice and any managerial role within the department. So obviously, Michael McBride had a managerial role which included oversight of RQIA. We know there were controversies around that. He also provided independent advice to the department. And Gabriel has touched on a very interesting point in that he's very different from someone like Sir Chris Whitty in the UK, in that Sir Chris Whitty was providing advice directly to the Prime Minister, whereas we didn't have a chief scientific advisor to the government here. I think in the evidence, it's been widely accepted that was an error. And in one sense, we think that it's contributed to the silo mentality and this disconnect between the Department for Health and the executive office that has existed, where McBride was very much a health-oriented person who, as the pandemic began to unfold, had to become involved in a cross-government response. And he had been accused of overreach in terms of trying to sign off on papers that from the executive. And that's an issue in itself for someone who doesn't have a democratic mandate like a minister would have, for example.
So Health Minister Robin Swan, Health Minister then and now, and of course he was another major figure. So the main takeaways really from his evidence were his frustration at leaks of COVID executive papers, and the fact that he only realised the true scale of the COVID pandemic days before lockdown when he did some calculations about deaths on a sheet of paper. Now, Johnny, as a journalist listening to that evidence, you must have raised an eyebrow.
Oh, I think it was more jaw-dropping than raising an eyebrow, Claire, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, it was literally back of envelope stuff, wasn't it? And I suppose that speaks to what we were talking before about the lack of preparedness at that time, and the lack of a whole of government approach. Thinking more broadly about Robin and his evidence, you mentioned there about the leaks, and I think Fraser usually said at one point it was so common it was virtually a live feed. I mean, so it's always quite, I suppose, incestuous as a journalist to be thinking about. I mean, there is a place for leaks. That's one way. Obviously that information sometimes gets out to the public that otherwise wouldn't. I suppose in this case, what him and some of the other ministers were talking about was leaks that they saw, which had a political motive, which was trying to, I suppose, push the narrative in one direction or other. But I mean, uniformly, all the ministers seem to despair about the leaks. Somebody was obviously doing it. Other points he obviously talked about was how, I suppose, the executive lost the respect of the public throughout, particularly I suppose during the second wave going into that those meetings, those long and torturous meetings in November, which I think he described as his low point in politics, and I suppose coming so closely after the Bobby Story funeral. I think the phrase he used was they basically had, the public had lost the respect, I think with the Robin, one of the things he probably came out of the pandemic with his reputation not perhaps as damaged as some of the other ministers and politicians around at the time. And I think that was because he was, and he sort of talked to us himself. He saw that being a sole minister for his party, he thought that gave him more flexibility, and he wasn't tied. He mentioned that Sinn Féin always had their eye on Dublin. The DUP always had their eye on Westminster. He sort of suggested they were unable to break out of those political straitjackets. He suggested, I'm not sure the evidence entirely backs it up, that he was unencumbered by that and was able to operate with a bit more freedom. But yeah, it was a long and tough day of evidence for him. I suppose you have this continuity thing as well, obviously, where now he's back in health minister, but not for long, because he's going off to fight an election soon. In many ways, this will be, I suppose, COVID will always be Swan's legacy. And whenever the inquiry eventually reports, that final chapter will be written.
Yeah. And Lauren, how did you feel whenever you heard Robin Swan giving evidence he was the man responsible for looking after us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think his evidence was particularly interesting. Obviously, he was very much sort of the fall guy for a lot of what happened during the pandemic, and he was referenced quite a lot by other witnesses in terms of it was his department and his lead. So in a way, you sort of feel sorry for him a little bit, because he is really taking on the burden of the pandemic in that way. But I thought it was interesting how he made the distinction between the restrictions being legal, yes, but perhaps not morally right. So I thought that was welcomed by a lot of the families, because obviously a lot of us were impacted by being locked out of care homes, and not being able to access schemes like the care partners and things like that. So I think that was interesting that he acknowledged that. But I also think that it was right that I think it was our council that made the point that between 20 and 30% of deaths from COVID in Northern Ireland happened in care homes. So I think it was interesting and very much welcomed that he recognised that there were particularly a lot of failings in care homes. I also find it interesting, however, that I think it was Council for Disability Action and I brought up the fact that there had been no meeting with them in 2021, even though they had requested an urgent one with the minister. And he apologised for that. But I suppose from my perspective, especially because I'm very much interested in the disability side of things, to hear that, even when he was approached for engagement in terms of disability and people trying to advocate for people, he still couldn't find time in his schedule to allow for that to happen. So that was disappointing to hear. The apology was welcomed in terms of that, but I think, quite frankly, apologies aren't really good enough. We need to see action from that, so that in the future, whenever he is consulted in terms of engaging with particularly more vulnerable groups, that he takes on board that and actively makes an effort to engage with as many stakeholders as he can.
Yeah, I think he said with hindsight, he should have made time for the meeting. Gabriel, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah. I mean, I hate all this hindsight business that we get repeatedly, but some of these people should have had a bit of insight or even a bit of foresight instead of relying on hindsight all the time. And that speaks to leadership. And, was this a Minister of Health displaying leadership qualities at the time is the question. Was it? Was this a Chief Medical Officer displaying leadership on the public health, not managerial responsibilities within the department at the time? And I think leaks, the great antidote to leaks is making information available, and perhaps there hasn't been any discussion, I don't know, about the volume of information or the information and accessibility of people in the Department of Health and the other departments to talk to journalists and to talk to the public in Northern Ireland. I know I spoke to a lot of Northern Ireland journalists at the time, and they were finding it really difficult getting any information. And the feeling that the Department of Health press office would talk to a few favoured people, and that was about it, and then not regularly. And the antidote to leaks is making information freely available. And I found their website particularly difficult to use as well. So, and my final point is this: there was a vast amount of inaction, as we know now from the inquiry, has laid that bare, and people sitting on their thumbs. But this also has echoes for me of all the inquiries that have gone on, and also like the Muckamore inquiry, and again the way in which people with learning difficulties don't really count for a lot of people, and were neglected, and the treatment of them was grossly neglected, hugely neglected, and their care, and the hyponatremia inquiry about children. And indeed, one of those children had learning difficulties and wasn't treated properly. And those and some of the other issues that are the subject of health public inquiries in Northern Ireland, those are issues that should have been dealt with, but people didn't deal with the issues. They sat on their thumbs, or even worse, tried to cover them up. And I think, and some of the same names recur. Some of the same names pop up in those inquiries as are popping up in the whole COVID business as well. So there is culturally a real problem exposed here.
Well, speaking of leaders and hindsight, we will talk a little bit about Michelle O'Neill, the former Deputy First Minister, now First Minister. She apologised for going to the funeral of senior Republican Bobby Storey. Among other things, her evidence exposed the failure to stand up civil contingency arrangements, despite having the power to do so. And Claire Dobbin, Casey, also examined her witness statement and suggested that she had blamed others for some of the things going on. And how do you think she was perceived?
Yeah, a totally devastating cross-examination from Claire Dobbin, and undoubtedly a very difficult day for Michelle O'Neill. I'm sure one of her most difficult in office. A few key points to pick up on. You've mentioned the standing up of NICMA, which is Northern Ireland's civil contingency arrangements. Now, people don't often generally have cause to know about these types of arrangements, but when something like a pandemic comes along, they suddenly become very important. What was very concerning, and it goes back to the disconnect between the Department for Health and the Executive Office, is that no one seemed to be sure who had responsibility for standing up those arrangements. So we had the Department for Health taking a lead on the pandemic in the early days in January and February and for a bit of March 2020. when actually the First Minister and Deputy First Minister had the power to stand up those civil contingency arrangements. They blamed the Department for Health and said, well, they never told us to, we weren't advised to. And it goes back to Gabriel's point about leadership. Ultimately, these are the people who their ultimate responsibility in whatever aspect of their role is to protect citizens. And the fact that they didn't see fit to request the information from the department, if they weren't satisfied, to ask the questions that needed to be asked, to attend the meetings that they were invited to throughout February that would have given them the information they needed. They didn't ask those questions. They had the power to stand NICMA up, and they didn't do it. That's the first thing. The second point, and it's kind of been discussed, ad nauseum in this inquiry, is the Bobby Story funeral. She's apologised finally for that. The apology is one thing. The bigger issue really is how it impacted on the pandemic itself. Did it cause a reduction in compliance with public health restrictions following that? But perhaps more importantly, did it cause a fallout in the executive that resulted in an inability to come to collegiate decisions following that? And I think the evidence would suggest that it did, in fact, because in that period following that, you've seen the joint press conferences between the First and Deputy First Minister stopping. The former head of the Civil Service, David Stirling, described a discernible chill in the executive office following it. And then we've got the autumn leading into the winter months, where we see this exponential rise in transmission and an inability to take effective decisions to intervene to protect the most vulnerable. It's difficult to really establish a chain of causation there, and someone like Gabriel would be much better qualified than I would. But ultimately, this culminated in a January 2021 peak, the highest rate of COVID deaths in Northern Ireland, and that was down to a combination of factors in the view of our clients. The third and final key point for Michelle O'Neill was the issue of data loss. Again, an issue that has been talked about at length during this inquiry. The chronology set out by Claire Dobbin KC really set this in very plain terms. Michelle O'Neill had received legal advice and received advice from the head of the Civil Service in November 2021 to retain information, including informal communications like WhatsApp. The executive then collapsed in February 2022, and she said she wiped her phone in accordance with general practice when the executive collapses. I suppose the truth of the matter was that she was fully aware of her obligations to retain the evidence. She didn't. We've seen some of her WhatsApps from Arlene Foster, with her and Arlene Foster, but that's come from the DUP end. So that's really the only insight we have. The messages that have been lost and deleted won't be recovered. We don't know what they contain. The broader point around that is really, as Johnny has mentioned, around RHI. Data loss was a huge issue there. There was recommendations made, and in fact, there was a culture change required in relation to the retention of data, and lessons haven't been learned since then. And that came out very clearly in the evidence of Michelle O'Neill.
Arlene Baroness Foster, once again, she was challenged on the failure to stand up NICMA. We learned interesting things about the cross-community vote. We heard about a lack of leadership, and as Enda said, particularly in autumn 2020. There's been a lot of talk about the feisty exchanges between Baroness Foster and Claire Dobbin, and some would say an odd reference to women of a certain age not being able to get their hair done every 2 weeks. What did you think about her evidence and Michelle's, and perhaps both of them together?
On the Story funeral, I think, and we'd never seen Michelle O'Neill like this before, because always, within the party, within Sinn Féin, within the executive office, the media is quite controlled and managed. This was, it's about to say throw the wolves as were, but it was brutal. And the problem, there was I don't know if it's a strategy or a decision within the party that they knew that the position of simply saying we're sorry for hurt caused was not going to stand in that inquiry, in that room, when there were victims in that room. So they had to go further, and they did go further. And he said for the first time, obviously, they apologised for actually going and said they shouldn't have gone. The problem they have is, and this, Claire Dobbin put them over this again and again and again, was that this cannot have been a surprise. You knew in advance the level of organisation which went into this funeral. It did not happen by accident, and she was put over this and invited again and again and again to comment on it, and there was no comment to be made on it, other than essentially inviting and I'm not preempting the findings, but inviting the chair of the inquiry to essentially come to the conclusion that the position at the time was Bobby's story was different than anybody else, and therefore they saw fit to take a different approach. And whenever you see the minutes of that executive meeting a couple of days later, the one that the inquiry had to ask for 7 times and they were lost, and eventually they were found. You see it there where Miss O'Neill says Bobby's story was a huge figure. They knew thousands would wish to attend, and then you have Arlene Foster coming in later and saying that she can't stand on a platform. This is again speaking to what Enda said. She can't stand on a platform with me, and that was, we'd had that as of the positive things that came out of COVID were those joint press conferences at that time, which were quite effective. The two political old foes, if you want to put it that way, standing together in a joint public health message, and that ended for quite a considerable period of time after that. And that is as a huge difficulty and remains. So the other issue then on the lost the data loss, the WhatsApp messages, it was quite almost bizarre seeing Claire Dobbin talking her through this process of how these messages, the chronology. You were told the messages were wiped, and again there was no real answer other than saying, I thought I was doing the right thing, almost giving the impression that she didn't understand the regulations and what she was being asked, and saying, I thought I was following the rules, but if it turns out I wasn't, then I'm very sorry. And again, it'll be up to the chair how credible they find that evidence. Moving on to Arlene, we know that Baroness Foster can, whenever she's under pressure, she can be quite spiky. I think all journalists who've interviewed over the years are quite it was only because she was appearing the day after she'd had the benefit. Hindsight, she knew, I suppose, what the points of attack were going to be, and for the DUP, that the pressure was always going to be on obviously about the early days and the lack of standing up the emergency response, but particularly for her party in November, and that terrible time when they couldn't agree on the regulations, and DUP triggered that cross community vote, which is essentially a veto. And again, Claire Dobbin went over this in some detail, and again, inviting her to was it a sectarian issue? She said, no, it's not a sectarian issue. Well, how do you justify it then? How do you explain it? And this narrative that they were trying to seek consensus. I mean, essentially, it's very difficult to come to any other conclusion that they're saying, well, you're not going to do anything that our party doesn't want to do, and they use a mechanism which is there to protect minorities, to ensure that came to be, and eventually the executive were able to agree. But like the Storey funeral, that period of uncertainty, it's the delay, and also then the public fracturing of relations. Both of those things obviously have an impact on public confidence in the messaging. And what just to finish, I don't want to hog the line out of it. One of the quotes that jumped out at me straight away from Claire Dobbin, who I thought got so much information out of the ministers in such a short period of time, was hers this comment that Northern Ireland essentially was sleepwalking into the pandemic. And Baroness Foster, was awfully quite irritated, and she found that comment quite offensive. But then the next follow on from that as well. tell us how it wasn't the case, show us how it wasn't the case. And again, I say I'll be up to the chair today, but the evidence that was set out in those early months of the pandemic, and the silo within the Department of Health, the lack of initiative within the executive office to step in, sleepwalking seemed to be an apt phrase, I thought.
Yeah. And of course, no one summed up everything, or no one could have summed it up any better than Brenda Campbell, Casey, when she was speaking on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Families for Justice in her closing submission. And I mean, it really was heartbreaking. Every word gave you pause for thought. And you're probably best placed to maybe talk us through her comments.
Yeah, look, I think she captured the feeling of the bereaved families very well, which is often difficult to do in a courtroom where legalese can sometimes take over. But what we need to realise here is we're talking about decisions which had the most significant impact on people. So I think she summed it up quite well by saying that in the quite short period of time where we've heard evidence, it's akin to a trailer from a movie, where we've seen the highlights and the lowlights of COVID. And, we've rhymed some of them off as we've been speaking here. The delay in response, the lack of planning, the story funeral, the cross-community vote. We've been able to scratch the surface on a lot of those major issues, and that's been an achievement for the inquiry. But obviously we haven't looked at everything, and hopefully we will get to do that in later modules. I guess the most important thing to come out of the closing statement was the exasperation and the dismay, really, at the approach that this government has taken, and really the lack of learning that has taken place from recent failures. I've mentioned RHI already. She ended with a quote from Mo Molam, which was, "Now bloody well get on and do it." And I think that was echoed by Brenda Doherty outside court afterwards. And that's really a reference to the fact that the inquiry will go away now after having heard all of this evidence. The chairperson, Baroness Hallett, will prepare a report with recommendations to government and departments about what can be changed to address the failures that have happened here. And really, that's one step in the process. The next step is for those measures to be fully implemented without delay and without qualification. And I think and I hope the chair has taken on board what was said on behalf of the bereaved families.
So it was the last week of the inquiry sitting in Belfast. So if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to ask you all to pick a standout moment from the inquiry sitting in Belfast over the last 3 weeks. So Gabriel, I'll start with you. Was there anything that struck you?
A lot of what I saw was really very boring stuff. And the only standout moment for me was actually, quite surprisingly, for me anyway, Michelle O'Neill's apology for the Story funeral, and the way she just said it straight out, no equivocation, no deviation, and clearly, well rehearsed and agreed in advance, I would think. But at least she said sorry for something, and and that she got something wrong. I think it was really very difficult to see too much contrition from other people so far. And that's about it. I wish there were more highlights, but it's difficult to find them.
Lauren, what about you?
I think for me, it's not so much one moment, but overall, I think it's finding that we can now challenge that narrative that was traditionally out in the public, that the government in Northern Ireland did the best they could with what they had. I think the evidence has actually shown that, quite frankly, if that's their best, I would hate to see their worst. The public are now aware of the scale of dysfunction that has been happening within not only the civil service, but the Assembly, the executive, and I mean, you could go on and on about the levels of it. But also the recklessness, that kind of idea that especially regarding things like testing in care homes and things, you know, people were just seen as dispensable, as in that somebody had to die and so you just had to let them. So I think that for me was the highlight, that now we can actually talk about it in a much more realistic sense instead of having the kind of romantic, heroistic version of it, you know, that these people knew what they were doing and they guided us through it, and well done them and high-fiving them. Because I think for a lot of our bereaved families, you know, these people were not heroes in any sense of the word. You know, they failed us. They failed us all, you know, utterly. And I think the COVID inquiry will hopefully name and shame them in a lot of ways into actually putting their money where their mouth is, and, you know, actioning on a lot of the things that they've been called out on.
And Johnny?
I'll mention a few things if that's okay, Claire. You know, I was very struck by the families, Brenda Doherty and Martina, on the way in the first day, saying we want total transparency. We want answers to these unanswered questions. I hope they've got them. One of the things that concerns me about and to go back to RHI and remembering how long RHI went on for, and how you had certain witnesses who were on the stand for 6-7 days, was I was always concerned that 3 weeks for Northern Ireland was short. And I remember looking at what the one day where they had 5 ministers, Conor Murphy ended up pulling out, but the 5 ministers all due to appear on the same day, and think, how can a public inquiry hear from 5 sets of? So that was always a concern of mine. I remember when Michael McBride was on the stand, and Brenda Campbell saying she had 10 minutes to question him, and she had 3 subjects. I think she actually ended up taking quite a bit more than 10 minutes, but just feeling that the whole time that it was constrained. And, you know, but having said that, I think the teams in there did an amazing job. They got so much information. Just one final one I'll probably just mention again on that same afternoon when Dr. McBride was giving his evidence, and Claire Dobbin referred to one of his WhatsApp messages, or one of his messages he'd sent around the time of that of November, the second wave. Where he said that the politicians should hang their head in shame, and he actually broke down and he became quite emotional. And it was I'd never seen that from Dr. McBride before, and you know, that was probably one of the most compelling moments of the whole thing. I just brought again back, you know, the human cost of the thing for everyone involved, I suppose, but particularly for the families.
And Enda?
Yeah, so for me, it was really the last couple of days, and the combination of Arlene and Michelle's evidence and the quite devastating, as I've mentioned, cross-examinations. Despite the time restrictions, which Johnny has mentioned, and which does make it a very difficult environment to get the answers that you need from politicians who are quite skilled at avoiding difficult questions, Claire Dobbin and our own barristers really got to the nitty-gritty quite quickly. They didn't allow time for grand political statements to be made. They cut through it. And that was particularly good when it happened with both witnesses, because obviously there's a tendency in Northern Irish politics for it to descend into green and orange, for want of a better word. Northern Ireland bereaved families for justice have always been of the opinion that the pandemic transcends politics. And of course it does. So there's absolutely no room for political game playing when it comes to something as serious as this. And I thought Claire Dobbin done a really good job with both of those witnesses.
Thank you to our guests on today's podcast, Lauren Mallon from Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice, public health expert Dr. Gabriel Scally, and journalist Johnny McCambridge from PA Ireland. Thanks to Enda McGarrity, also my co-host, and to everyone for listening.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share it with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinions, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.